In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. May peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah the Almighty be upon all of you. I am Umar bin Abid, and you are watching Umar Linguistics. So, dear viewers, today we are going to discuss the oro-nasal process and manners of articulation. So, if you haven't watched last 3 lectures, so I recommend that you watch those lectures as well, and in the description I have given the links as well. So the same lecture, this lecture, and as well as the last 3 lectures, you can watch either in English or in Urdu. So if you want to watch in Urdu, so I have given the link in the description by the name A Course in Phonetics, then English, and another link A Course in Phonetics Urdu/Hindi. So you can watch all lectures either in Urdu or in English. So because this is the bilingual channel, so actually I'll make all videos both in English as well as in Urdu. So in this lecture I'm going to speak in English, or in other words, this lecture will be in English, and if you want to watch this lecture in Urdu, so the link is given below. So if you haven't watched the last lecture, so it will be difficult for you to understand what I'm going to describe today. Or if you already know what are the places of articulation and you have the knowledge about this aspect, places of articulation, then you can understand this lecture easily. So let's start. So what is the oro-nasal process? So for example, if you just speak these words rang, ram, ran, and at the end of these words you will notice that the air is coming out of your nose, or in other words, in sequence, in each of these words, in each word the air is at first passing through mouth, as there is a velic layer. And you know what is the velic layer? When our soft palate or velum raises against the wall of the pharynx, so nasal cavity is closed, and at that time the air cannot pass through nasal cavity but through mouth. I have described all these aspects in the previous 3 lectures. For this you can watch the first lecture if you want to know about this aspect, but here I'll show you through picture as well once again. But the point of articulatory closure moves forward from velar in rang through alveolar in rang and to bilabial in ram. So what does it mean? So actually what is happening in rang? In rang the last sound is which is a nasal sound, and as well as this is the nasal sound, as well as sound is the velar sound. So what happens that our back of the tongue is touching the soft palate in the last sound. So our the articulated closure is happening at the place of the velar. What is mean by closure? I have described in the earlier lecture as well. Closure mean when the air stops at some place in the mouth. While in this word ran, because n sound is alveolar one, when our tip or blade of the tongue touches the alveolar ridge. So here is the closure. When we say ran, at this point there is a closure. The air stops at this point. And in this sound at the end we have is bilabial sound. So there is the air closure at m sound, or in other words, there is articulatory closure at the bilabial place. Or we can say in other words, at the end of these words the velum is lowered. When velum is lowered, the air is passing through nose. And in most of the speech sounds, velum is actually raised, as we have few nasal sounds. So raising or lowering the velum control the oro-nasal process, the distinguishing factor between oral and nasal sounds. So let me describe it through a picture as well. So when we say any word like book, so in the word book we have no word like where you can say the this one. In for example, word like by. In by we are not producing any nasal sounds. So here you can see the velum or this soft palate is raised against the wall of the pharynx. So here there is this is called the velic closure, and now the air will pass through mouth. When we say by, at the end the air will pass through mouth. But if we say a word like my, so because in my the first sound is a nasal sound, so you can see the velum is not actually raised, but velum is lowered, or velum is here forward to some extent, and now the air is passing through nasal cavity. Same is the case in the word same is the case at the end of these words rang, ram, and ran. In all three words, so there is the velum is actually lowered, or velum is actually here, so the air is passing at the end of all three words through nose. Now we are going to discuss manners of articulation. So actually this is what we call oro-nasal process. When the air is passing through a nose and we are producing some sound when air is passing through nose, so we say that it is a nasal process. But when air is passing through mouth and the velum is raised against the wall of the pharynx, so we call it uh, an oral process. So therefore we call it the oro-nasal process. And now we are going to discuss manners of articulation. So while producing consonants, our articulators come into contact with each other at different places. Sometimes our tongue is touching at the alveolar ridge, sometimes our back of the tongue is touching the soft palate, sometimes our tongue is protruding between the upper and the lower teeth, sometimes our upper and lower lip come together. So these are different manners of producing sounds, and while producing these sounds the air is obstruct in one way or the other way. So the obstruction of air in all these different positions is different. For example, the stoppage of air in for example in producing like b or m sound is different as compared to uh, n or m sound, or as compared to k or g sound, or as compared to ch sound. So in all these sounds, our articulators are making contact with each other at different places, so the obstruction of air in we know the air obstructs in every consonant, but how it obstructs it is different in every consonant. And so the articulators may close off the oral tract for an instant or for a relatively long period, and they may narrow the space considerably. What does it mean by narrowing the space? That the air is passing just through a narrow space. In many of the consonants like b or t or d, and for some and on the other side on the other hand, sometimes our articulators modify the shape of the vocal tract by approaching each other. So in some cases the closure or the space is not as narrow as in some sounds. So we are going to discuss all these manners of articulation. So first of all, we have stop. In stop, what happens? There is a complete closure of the articulators involved, so that the airstream cannot escape through the mouth easily. And there are two possible types of stop. One is the oral stop and the nasal stop. So in oral stop, what happens? That soft palate raises against the wall of the pharynx and nasal cavity is blocked. Airstream is completely obstructed in the mouth. Pressure builds and finally released of airstream in a small burst. For example, when we say pie, buy, tie, die, kai, guy. So at the beginning of all these words, the first sound is actually a stop, an oral stop. And p, b, this is a bilabial closure. Why this is called bilabial closure? Because the lips come together and the closure is there. In th, in thai and die, the first sound th and d, because both these sounds are pronounced at the alveolar ridge, so there is a closure at the alveolar ridge. Just focus on saying th, th. While saying Thai, just keep your tongue at that position of th for a long time. So you will notice that the air is completely closed here. There is a complete closure of the articulators here. Same is the case with die and kai, a guy. And in these sounds, actually is back of the tongue is making contact with the soft palate. So for example, when you say k, k, kai, guy, so you will notice that there is a complete closure once again at soft at the position of soft palate or velum. These sounds are also called plosives in the International Phonetic Association chart. So I'll also show you that chart as well after a while. So if we just look at the position of the word by, this word, so we can see that the velum is raised against the wall of the phalanx, and there is a complete closure here, bilabial closure here, and the pressure builds in the mouth, and there will be a sudden release when we say by. So these happen oral stops. And if we have an oral stop like Thai, so what happens, the tongue will touch here. So when tongue will touch here, so there will be a closure of air here, and air cannot pass through the mouth easily unless we'll move our tongue from that position. In nasal stop, what happens, air stops in oral cavity once again, but now the velum is lowered and air passes through nasal cavity. And sounds at the beginning of words, for example, my, nigh, and sang, and at the end of words, sang. So all these sounds are the example of bilabial closure. Sorry, nasal stop, because the air is passing now through nose. So at my, my is the bilabial sound, so there is a closure at this position. In na, it is an alveolar closure because the position of na is alveolar ridge, and at the end of sang we have sound which we actually show through this symbol, sang. So because this is pronounced through velar position, so therefore it is called velar closure. And apart from the presence of a velic opening, so in oral stops there is velic closure, in nasal stop there is velic opening. So apart from the presence of velic opening, there is no difference actually between a nasal stop my and an oral stop by. The difference is only that then in by we have velic closure, and in my we have velic opening. So this is the figure which shows the position of articulators in the word my. So here you can see the velum is actually lowered, and velum is not pressed against the wall of the pharynx, so there is a space. But because in my there is a bilabial closure once again, so now the air is, when we say our lips are actually, our mouth is not actually opening, but we are still producing sound. How? Because the air is passing through our nose. So we must remember that both nasal stops and oral stops can be classified just as stops. But the term stop is always used by phoneticians to indicate an oral stop. So phoneticians use the term stop just to indicate an oral stop, and the term nasal is used to indicate a nasal stop. In other words, uh, it is a technical term, stop. So stop is always used by phoneticians just to indicate an oral stop, not to a nasal stop. And to indicate a nasal stop, they just use the word nasal. However, so therefore we can say technically the beginning consonants of the words day and nay would be called an alveolar stop and a nasal stop. So the beginning of the word day is an alveolar stop, which is a d sound, and beginning of the word ne is an nasal stop. So, but the term stop may be defined only to the prevention of air through the mouth. Uh, we can stop. We can also say whenever the air stops in the mouth completely. We can say any of that, or you can say we can say that process stop. And commonly a complete stoppage of airflow both through nose and the mouth is called stop. So commonly for common people, or commonly when we say stops, so we are actually indicating both nasal and oral stops. But technically, as a phonetician, when we have to talk, so we have to indicate oral stop and nasal stop separately. Then we have fricative. So in fricative, there is close approximation of two articulators. In other words, the two articulators are approximately close to each other, so that the airstream is partially obstructed, not completely obstructed. What was happening in bilabials or in stops, which are also called plosives, that the air was the articulators come into contact with each other. You can say completely, and there was a complete closure of air. But here the articulators are approximately come close to each other, and the airstream is partially obstructed, not completely obstructed, and the airflow is turbulent. Turbulent means that the airflow is sudden, and in a, you can say, in a non-systematic way. There is no systematic way of airflow in this is the mean of turbulent. So this mechanism also involved in making these slightly hissing sounds. So actually in fricative we make slightly hissing sound, just like the wind whistles around a corner, like uh, just like this. So the consonants in phi and y, when you say so you can feel a hissing sound phi, or in y. But f is a voiceless fricative, and v is the voice fricative, and the position is labiodental. Then we have psi and xi, which is actually the dental fricatives. And then we have psi, once again you can feel the hissing sound, and zu, alveolar, because the s and the position are alveolar. And then we have the shy, which is a palato alveolar. So these are the examples of fricative sounds. And note that the narrowing of the vocal tract between the blade of the tongue and back part of the alveolar is in palato alveolar fricative shy. So if we just note the narrowing of the vocal tract between the blade of the tongue and the back part of the tongue in palato alveolar fricative. So actually shy is a in shy, sh sound is a palato alveolar fricative. Sh, sh. So what will happen, you can notice that the at first the our blade of the tongue will touch at the back of the alveolar ridge while producing this sound sh, 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 and then it will touch it will go close to the palatal as well, therefore it is called palato alveolar fricative. And the higher pitch sounds with the more obvious hiss in fricative sounds, so they like uh, this sound and this sound sh, sigh and shy. So s and sh are actually called sometimes sibilants, because these are higher pitch sounds with more obvious hiss. And you can feel that if I say s and z, in the I have not more obvious pitch as compared to s. So therefore s and sh are sometimes also known as sibilants. Then we have approximant, as the name suggests. So what happens, one articulator is close to another in approximant, but without the vocal tract being narrowed to such an extent that a turbulent airstream is produced. Uh, In fricative sounds, there was the vocal tract was narrowed to some extent that a turbulent airstream was produced. But in approximant, the vocal tract is not too narrow to produce a turbulent airstream. So therefore, these are called approximant. For example, in saying the first sound in yacht, which is actually have the this symbol yacht. So the front of the tongue is raised, as you can notice, toward the palatal area of the roof of the mouth when we say y, but it does not come close enough for a fricative sound to be produced. You will notice that while producing y sound, y, if you just notice it carefully and produce the sound y, so you will notice that the front part of the tongue is raised toward the palate, but it is not too close to the roof of the mouth to produce a fricative sound. Similarly, sometimes the consonant in the word we, um, shown by this symbol, and for some people, in the beginning of the word r, or in other words r sound, so they both of these sounds are sometimes also studied or also known as approximants. In we have approximation between the lips and in the velar region, and in raw we have approximation at the alveolar ridge, because when we say we, our sides of the lips meet with each other, and the articulation is at the velar region. And when we say raw, so in raw, the position of ra is actually alveolar ridge, or just behind the alveolar ridge. Then we have lateral approximant. So what happened in lateral approximant? So once again, there is the obstruction of airstream at a point along the center of the vocal tract, with incomplete closure between one or both sides of the tongue and roof of the mouth. So once again, just like approximant, these are lateral approximant. Once again, there will be no complete closure. There will be incomplete closure on both sides of the tongue and roof of the mouth. For example, when you say the word lie, and the beginning sound of this word l is actually an example of lateral approximant. So when you, for example, keep your tongue in l, so near the center of the alveolar ridge, l, l, and now prolong the initial consonant uh, at that position. Keep your tongue at that position, l, l, and you will notice that despite the closure formed by the tongue, the air because when we say l, we have actually closure at the alveolar region, but because our tongue is not so close to the roof of the mouth, so the air is passing through the sides of the tongue, over the sides of the tongue. For example, when we say l, and now after that, if you just breathe in at that position of the l, and then breathe in l, so you will notice that at one side of the tongue you will notice some cool air, and this is a sign that uh, the air is passing from the sides of the tongue, over the sides of the tongue freely. So therefore there is an incomplete closure, and due to no stoppage of air and not even any fricative noise, these sounds are classified as approximants, because they are not just like fricatives and there is no stoppage of air, so therefore they are called approximants. And we must note that the consonants in lie and laugh are actually alveolar lateral approximant. Sometimes we just say them alveolar laterals, because it is understood that alveolar laterals must be approximant, so we can just say alveolar laterals. And as I have described, so you can find that which side of the tongue is not in the contact with the roof of the mouth by holding the consonant position while you breathe in. For example, you say L, and while keeping your tongue in that position, just breathe in. So you will notice that at one side of the tongue you will notice some cool air. Now these were some basics or main manners of articulation, but there are some additional consonantal gestures, or there are some additional manners of articulation as well, because this is our preliminary chapter, this is our initial chapter. So we are not going to discuss each manner of articulation discussed in many other languages as well as in English, but uh, briefly we'll discuss the following: trill, which are sometimes called roll, and then tap, which are sometimes called flap, then affricate, and then glottal stop. If we talk about the trill or roll, so the place of articulation for trill or roll is retroflex, which we have actually discussed in last chapter. So actually what happens that the tongue will curl behind the alveolar ridge. So Scottish English have these sounds like roy, raw, and in Spanish we have also this sound as well, or this manner of articulation: roy, roll, roy, raw. Then tap or flap. So taps are sounds in which there is a single tap against the alveolar ridge in the middle of the word, such as pidi, pidi. And actually, this sound actually sometimes, if we carefully understand it, if we carefully listen to it, so it is not perceived as th, th. It is perceived as just like between the th and d, pidi, pidi. So if you listen to American speakers, or who are speaking American English, so you will notice that they will produce these sounds, this sound whenever the th sound come between uh, any word. So you will notice this sound quite frequently. Then we have affricate. So actually affricates are such sounds in which we have not only one manner of articulation, but it is a combination of more than one manners of articulation. For example, if we say the word cheap, so how you will make the first sound? So you will notice that the tongue will comes with contact with back part of the alveolar ridge at first. When we say ch, ch, first of all, the tongue will come at will make contact with the back of the alveolar ridge. Then this contact will be slackened mean this contact will be loose, so that there is a fricative at the same place of articulation. We do not stop we do not form a stop closure constantly or for a long time while producing this sound at the beginning sound of cheap, which is actually shown by this symbol ch. So first of all we have closure, then the contact is slackened, the contact is loosed, and there at the same time we produce there is a fricative at the same place of articulation ch. And then the a stop so what we can say, an affricate, a stop immediately followed by a fricative is called an affricate. A stop immediately followed by a fricative is called an affricate, and in this case the ch is actually palato-alveolar. This is its place of articulation, or post-alveolar affricate. So the this is the voiceless fricative, which is actually occurring at the beginning and at the end of word church, and there is a corresponding voice fricative which has this symbol judge at the end and at the start of this word judge. So this is a voice fricative and has the same position. Then we have a glottal stop. So in spelling, actually a glottal stop is sometimes not visible, so but it happens at sometimes at the beginning of the word, like eek, ok, ark, and these are pronounced with glottal stop at the beginning of the vowel. But this glottal catch at the beginning of these words isn't written in these words and is easy to overlook. However, when we have two words and the first word ends with a vowel and the second starts with a vowel, then a glottal stop is something obvious between these two words. For example, if we say flee east, so sometimes it is perceived as flee east, flee east, flee east. So here between these two words you will just notice a glottal stop, and usually we show it with this simple glottal stop. uh, Actually, if you just to understand it, what is a glottal stop? If you say oh 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 oh, so in oh oh ah oh, between these two words you are actually producing a glottal stop. Some people also pronounce it at the end of some words. So actually we'll discuss these manners of articulation in detail in the incoming chapters. You may notice that we have not discussed many manners of articulation like liquids, glides, but we'll discuss those articulations as well in the incoming chapter. So we can see what we have discussed so far about consonants. So we can describe consonants based on 5 factors. The first is the state of vocal folds. Either the vocal folds are vibrating or not, or in other words voiced or voiceless. Then we may discuss the place of articulation: bilabial, alveolar, labiodental, retroflex, or velar. Then we may discuss articulation, whether it is central or lateral articulation. What does it mean? That if the sound is pronouncing, if the if the tongue is touching at the velar position, at the soft palatal position, so it will be a lateral articulation, and if it's touching at the hard palate or alveolar ridge or bilabial, then it is central articulation. Then we have soft palate. Soft palate is raised or soft palate is lowered. As we know, soft palate is raised when we have oral sounds or oral process, and soft palate is lowered when we have nasal sounds or nasal process. And manner of articulatory action. And what is the manner of articulation? As we have just discussed, that either it is a bilabial, labiodental, bilabial, or fricative or affricate or something like that. So if we have this word sing, so just before I show you, let's discuss this word sing. So first of all, if we discuss the state of the vocal fold, so it is voiceless. Sing, at the beginning of the word sing, s is voiceless. Then if we discuss the place of articulation, s, so it is actually alveolar ridge. Then if we discuss its central or lateral articulation, so actually it is central articulation. Then soft palate is actually raised in s sound. And manner of articulatory action, so s will be a fricative because there is a hissing sound. So the first consonant is voiceless, alveolar, central, articulation, oral, and fricative, as we have discussed. And if we discuss the last sound of this word, which is actually this one, based on these 5 factors, so state of the vocal folds will be voiced because nasal sounds are voiced. Place of articulation, it is actually velar. Central or lateral articulation, so actually it is a lateral articulation because we are producing this sound at velar position. Then soft palate is actually lowered because it is a nasal sound. And manner of articulatory action, so it will be, I think, so it will be, yes, it will be a stop because it is a nasal, so nasal are actually stops in English. So these are the 5 factors. So sometimes, but the points 3 and 4 may be often left out. So the consonants at the beginning of the sing is simply called a voiceless alveolar fricative. In other words, we can skip its we can skip whether it is an oral or whether its articulation is central or oral, so we can skip these two aspects. uh, However, when describing nasal sounds, so point 4 need to be discussed, which is actually the either the velum is lowered or raised. So this point has to be specifically mentioned while describing nasal sounds. But point 5 can be skipped. So the consonants at the end of the sing is simply called a voiced, velar, and nasal. So this is all about today's lecture. I hope you have understood it, and the next lecture will be the acoustics of consonants.